Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. We're going to be going over some general stuff today regarding off-campus housing, off-campus engagement, some of the programs and whatnot that we oversee. And then my partner here, Wenmo, is going to go over some information that's going to be helpful for those of you who may be receiving financial aid or have someone in your group who might be receiving financial aid. We definitely recommend learning about the process along the way so then that way you know how to kind of move forward. So, general overview, some of the things that we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about some live-on requirements for students who are living on campus, what the on-campus housing waitlist is, specifically for students who may have applied. This is rising juniors and seniors who may have applied who were not issued a lottery number during this semester's housing application process. There may be some of you who are interested in knowing like what that might look like for living on campus. We'll go over a basic timeline. Things you should really be thinking about, in different periods of time while you're on campus, the specifics and the differences about on-campus versus off-campus living. That can be budgeting, that can be things that you need to provide for yourself, etc. If you're a student who is considering studying abroad or may have completed a study abroad interest form, or may also be interested in learning more about subletting, we'll go over some stuff there. We'll talk about budgeting, financial aid, payment plans, etc., as well as health and wellness while living off campus, navigating some of the challenges, and also some resources that we'll be able to provide while you're living off campus. Our office is the Residential Life and Learning office, and we are a portion of that team. So if anybody has questions or is interested in setting up an appointment with us, you're more than welcome to schedule an appointment with us. So just to kind of jump into some things, in regards to live on campus requirements, we do have a 2-year residency requirement. So that means that entering first year students are required to live in university housing for the equivalent of 4 semesters or 2 academic years while on campus. There are some students who will be able to request an exception to that if there's medical or religious reasons. Students who may go abroad during their sophomore year, that may also count towards this residency requirement. So if you've got specific questions, you can always reach out to us at studentservices@tufts.edu, and someone will be able to kind of get back to you about your specific situation. However, those are things that you should be planning. What that means is that after those 2 years, your on-campus housing where it may be available is not necessarily guaranteed. So what that means is that this may be a place where you're looking to live off campus, or maybe you applied for on-campus housing and you weren't issued a lottery number and now are looking for off-campus housing. So with that said, we've got a housing wait list for rising juniors and seniors who apply to on-campus housing or apply to live in a theme or special interest community or a fraternity sorority space and who do not get that space kind of solidified for the time that they're on campus. You do have the option to join our housing wait list. What that means is after we've kind of gone through our housing selection process in which we're trying to house students who are seeking housing for the full academic year, we are going to be able to see what spaces are available and reach out to students who have added themselves to our wait list. If you're someone who is interested in being added to the housing wait list, you can do that through your online housing portal. So just make sure to review some communications that would have come from Residential Life and Learning about how to do that. And if you have additional questions on how to manage that process, you can email studentservices@tufts.edu for assistance. So when you're living in on-campus housing and off-campus housing, a lot of students who are, looking to live in these particular spaces are predominantly looking for certain types of rooms and whatnot. And that also goes for our students who may have medical accommodations or religious accommodations that need to be met. When you're living off-campus, it is very similar. However, there isn't a star center to work with in the off-campus side of things. So we do want to make sure that if you are a student who has some sort of housing accommodation, and needs to be in a certain type of living situation. And when you're looking for your off-campus housing, those are the things that you are kind of going to be focusing on. You can consider the Americans with Disability Act in relation to living in those spaces. Landlords can't discriminate against students whose needs are met within a reasonable accommodation. However, The question is, what is reasonable? So it's really dependent on your particular situation, the spaces that are available, et cetera, and the things that you will need. But if you are a student or you and your family feel that there's some sort of bias during your search process, we do encourage you to seek out some legal assistance or reach out to the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, which you might not be able to click that link, but you will be able to find some information online. So we definitely recommend that if that is a need of yours. So some of the big differences between living on campus versus living off campus, obviously in your first and second year, you're here, you've got, furniture is supplied for you, your utilities are covered, et cetera, et cetera. But some of the big things is really in terms of who it is you're living with. As a first year student, you don't get to select your roommates. You do submit a housing survey, which is very similar to the rest of the application, where we are looking to match people who have similar living preferences. So that means, are you going to sleep at around the same time? Are you someone who needs noise when you go to sleep, et cetera, et cetera? Those are things that we're looking to try and connect people on. We have a higher rate of room retention and a lower rate of room change requests amongst students when they are completing that form, and we're able to kind of match them together. When they first meet, they are doing a roommate living agreement just to kind of go over some of the things that may not have been followed up in that particular housing survey. And that kind of ensures that you're having those helpful relationships and conversations along the way as a student living in on-campus housing. When you're applying for on-campus housing in your future semesters, you have the opportunity to select your roommate or your suite mate. And so that's really cool. But at the same time, we want to make sure that you're also considering that sometimes your friends are not necessarily the best roommates. You might be really close friends, have a lot of things in common, interests in common, et cetera. But perhaps you're someone who goes to sleep a lot earlier. Perhaps you're someone who stays up later, someone who may need noise when they go to sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things that we want to make sure that you're thinking about. And the same thing goes when you're living off campus. You get to select your housemates. You get to select your roommates. Sometimes you don't get to do that. Sometimes you may be an individual who is looking for a group to join. And so those are types of questions and things that you really want to make sure that you're asking before you confirm that you're going to be living with folks. The challenge that we see, and one of the big things that's noted on this page, is that room change request process, right? When you're living in on-campus housing, say something comes about where you are in need of a room change request. We have limited spaces on campus that are available that we can work with you to have some sort of a room change, but it's not always guaranteed. We do request that you go through kind of a process, making sure you're having those necessary conversations with your housemates or your roommates to kind of see what's going to be beneficial. But when you're living off campus, the chances that you're able to move out of that space is very, very limited, much more limited than when you're living in on-campus housing. Despite having your own room, you will have to share common spaces, et cetera. And so if you're finding that you're not getting or not having the best relationship with your roommates, that can be really challenging. So we definitely recommend that prior to signing that lease, prior to accepting, a proposal to move in with someone, that you're having those really tough conversations. We do have some resources on our website that can help you with navigating those conversations. So we definitely recommend going and checking out those things. Some students might ask if they're moving too fast. It being November, you may even feel like you're moving a lot slower. There are a lot of students who have signed leases in August, September. I honestly think that could be a little bit too fast, but I do realize that there is a stress level that is kind of involved with this entire process. And so we want to make sure that regardless of when you sign your lease, that you're getting as much information and feeling as secure as possible in that process. But some of the things I want you all to think about as to whether or not you're moving too fast are, if you sign a lease right now, what happens if your friend group doesn't stay the same, or if your finances change over the next year? As I mentioned before, breaking a lease or getting out of your lease is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Even if you chose to not live there any longer, if your name is on that lease, you are still financially responsible for that. And so those are things that you should really consider before signing that lease. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of spaces that are available for rent in August, September, even now, but a lot of that is because a lot of landlords in the areas are looking to secure their tenants a year in advance. They want to make sure that it's kind of handled, it's out the way, they don't have to deal with it. And there's nothing that says that they can't do that. However, something to recognize is that a lot of people could profit off of the stress that you have in that situation. You feel an anxiety in needing to secure something quickly. And whereas that's understandable and in many times, warranted, I will also say that you want to make sure that you have as much information as possible. There's still going to be spaces in February, March, which is typically around the time when we're saying that students should be looking for off-campus housing. That's when spaces are going to start to pop up a little bit more. We do see it come in waves. So we want to use this time to make sure that you all are clear on the process or try to have as much details as possible before signing that lease. So here is just a quick little diagram of what a typical timeline might look like for our rising sophomores. The spring of your first year, you're going to be thinking a lot about it. The summer before your second year, you're probably getting that group together. The start of the fall of your second year, there may be students who are interested in signing that lease, and then you're kind of jumping into things. But I would say let's hold off a little bit if we can. We do have some time. You want to consider other things such as, are you planning to study abroad? What is going to be financially doable for you, etc. Do you have a secure group? Is everybody in that group comfortable with the choices, etc.? For rising juniors and seniors, obviously, you're going to be thinking very similar stuff. If you are a rising junior or senior and you are interested in living on campus, if you sign your lease in August, September, you kind of remove the process. You've kind of removed the opportunity to apply for on-campus housing. So we want to make sure that you're kind of adhering to a calendar that's going to make a little bit more sense. Our housing application process opened for our rising juniors and seniors in October. It's since closed. And so if that is something that you're interested in doing, you kind of have to wait until after that time has passed, because you don't want to tie yourself up in a lease if you really would prefer to live in on-campus housing. Now, with that, it is possible to get out of your lease in some cases. If you do it early enough, it could be a lot easier. And I definitely recommend setting up an appointment with me so we can discuss some alternatives and some ways to kind of have that conversation, either with your group or with your landlord. But those are things that we can't talk about. So if you find yourself in that situation, we can talk more about your individual situation on a one-on-one capacity. This is just giving a little bit more of a breakdown, specifically for students who are in their second year and really determining like what that process is going to look like for them. We definitely recommend that you talk to your friends, potential guardians who are involved in the selection of your housing, discuss the possibility of going abroad. So if that's something that you're interested in doing and you may only be around and on campus for a semester, will you have someone to take over your space? Start thinking about budgeting and finances. What can you feasibly afford? If you're a student who is getting financial aid, have you met with your financial aid rep? And like I said, we'll be getting into that a little bit, some general information in the next couple of slides, just to kind of make sure that you have some details on how to go. You can also start your housing search, just trying to get some information about like what those costs are going to be, or what are things you need to potentially, plan for. And if you are looking at a specific place, you might want to know whether or not the landlord allows subletting. Some landlords do not. And so that's something to keep in mind. If you were to sublet your space and your landlord does not allow it, that is a technical breach of your contract. Your lease is a contract. It's a legal contract. And so we want to make sure that you're not putting yourself in any challenging situations by doing something that is not allowed. Okay. For students in their second semester of their second year, if you haven't already signed the lease, that's something that you're probably going to be doing at that time. You want to consider expenses a little bit further. Do you need furniture? Who's going to bring what, etc. And we have lots of resources in off-campus engagement that we can help kind of navigate with you. We do offer kind of a but a furniture swap type of program towards the end of the year. So students who may already live off campus who are looking to get rid of furniture may be able to pass it along to you all, or other types of items. But those are all things that we offer. So again, the general details between living on campus and living off campus. When you're on campus, you're looking at a 9-month academic year. You're signing a housing license agreement, which has a little bit more stipulations when you're living in on-campus housing. Off campus, it's for a 12-month period. You're signing a rental lease. You have a little bit more freedom, but you still need to be within the parameters that are listed in that lease. Your finances are going to look a little bit different between on and off campus housing. When you're on campus, you're paying everything all in one. It's usually paid upfront each semester. As a student who lives off campus, that's going to be a month-to-month situation, either to your landlord or your property manager. There is a student who is going to be responsible for having the utilities in their name. So that way, those things are covered on a month-to-month basis. Many times those things do fluctuate in cost. So we want to make sure that that's handled. And then there's personal items. When you're living on campus, we provide you with furniture. We provide you with, paying for all the utilities and whatnot. There are limitations to what you can have in on-campus housing for safety reason and everything. But when you're living off campus, that is something that you're going to be responsible for covering. In both situations, we highly recommend having renter's insurance that's on campus and off campus. Renter's insurance is fairly inexpensive, usually $10 to $15 a month. You can usually get a discount if you pay for the full year in advance. If your family or guardians own their own home, you may be able to add yourself onto their homeowner's insurance. So that's something to look into as well. But we highly recommend it because you never know when something unfortunate might happen, such as a fire or a flood or something of the course that ends up damaging all of your items, et cetera, et cetera. We want to make sure that you're able to kind of get those things resolved after the fact. So make sure that you have those details. Unfortunately, there have been fires off campus over the years, and we want to make sure that our students have the things that they need in order to get those items back. So just to kind of focus on the studying abroad and subleasing process, the housing application has now closed for juniors and seniors, so any additional applications at this point are going to lead to the wait list. For rising sophomores, the application deadline is due in January, so keep an eye on that. November 1st, which is already passed, was the deadline for students to submit their study abroad intent through Global Education. And students who would have received a housing lottery number should have already received that information. For those students, specifically our juniors and seniors, housing selection is going to happen in early December. Now, for those students who have a lottery number, if you are still exploring the off-campus housing process and you choose not to go ahead with housing selection, if you don't participate in that, it's not going to carry over. You kind of lost your chance, and those are spaces that we're potentially going to offer to students on the wait list. So we want to make sure that you have that information. If you are a student who has submitted an intent to study abroad, those are things that are not going to be available for you all as well. So we want to make sure that you have that handled. This is actually, let me go back to that previous slide. We do have some slides or some ways to connect with other students on campus. Our Tufts off-campus Canvas page is a way that you can connect with folks via our discussion boards and whatnot. We have a subletting e-list or our connection page, which I have on the next slide, and I'll give a little bit of detail on. But essentially, if you are someone who is going abroad or just looking for someone to take over a lease or looking for a room for a semester, you can proceed with that process, and we can see about connecting you with people with like criteria. We have our off-campus housing website, which is via apartments.com, where you can search for on-campus spaces. You can connect with roommates, and the cool thing about that is that you can connect with potential roommates, both Tufts students and non-Tufts students, specifically at other universities. It is a college-based site, so you will need to utilize your username and password to log in. For anybody who still has a Facebook, you can search Facebook pages. I will say that Tufts off-campus housing and off-campus engagement does not manage any off-campus pages. So anything that you come across that says Tufts off-campus housing is not run by our office. So I would recommend that anything you do in those venues, in any venues really, you're using your due diligence. And then there are class GroupMe chats where you can also recognize and reach out to people. So I do also recognize that there are other ways of connecting with students, whether it's side chat, whether it's Instagram, etc. In any case, we advise you to use due diligence, have those tough conversations, and see, is this going to be a comfortable situation? We don't want the stress of needing to find off-campus housing end up creating a challenging situation for you or for other people. So to go over our subletting connection form, this is essentially a form that we've created to really kind of help you connect with other students, specifically tough students who are looking for sublessors or subleases that are going to match their individual criteria. Our form is going to ask you some very basic information. As you can see over on the right-hand side, the screenshot of the question form, whether or not you have a room and you're looking for a subletter, or you're someone who is looking to rent a room, which semester or semesters you're looking to sublet for. There are students who will, check off the boxes for the full year, and that's totally fine. We'll try to connect you with people, but keep in mind that is far less frequent. So that's something to keep in mind. Those forms are also going to ask if you have a particular budget, which is typically in the range of what we have seen, so less than $1,000 or more than $1,300. This is going to ask for any gender preferences. We do recognize that there are some students who would prefer to live with a group of students whose gender matches a certain identity. There is the option for mixed gender housing, etc. But we want to make sure we're matching you with appropriate group. For students who may need furniture rental, for students who may have a pet or a support animal, or are whether or not they're okay with a pet or a support animal, those are things that we want to make sure that we are connecting you on as well. There is a QR code at the bottom of the screen, so if you are interested in signing up for that connection form, feel free to scan that QR code. If this page kind of goes away a lot faster before you're able to do that, you can also access this QR page, or the form, and the link for the form on our off-campus page on our main Tufts website. We're going to go into finances. So I have a couple of slides here about finances, and then I'm going to turn it over to Wenmo, who goes over financial aid. So if that's an area of interest for you all, please stick around. So the typical amount in rent that we are seeing for students who live off campus, and this is for a bedroom, it's only, per person, it's not including utilities, is anywhere from $800 to $1,300. You'll see that I have an asterisk here, and I'll kind of explain why that is. On average, this is the rent that we're seeing around. But what we are hearing from many of our students who are renting off campus, many of their rents are in the area of $1,150 to $1,400. And obviously that's a little bit different than this $800 to $1,300. So we wanted to make sure that you have the general range, but also our understanding of what the averages are in the area. That can depend on a lot of factors. That can depend on how many people live in the house, can be dependent on, how updated the house is, etc. So those are things to kind of really keep in mind. As I mentioned, utilities are not usually included. You can seek out spaces that do include utilities or include some utilities, but I would average that each student should estimate about $150 a month per person. That's to cover gas, that's to cover electric, that's to cover internet. You may have none of these, you may have all of these. You may not end up spending $150, but it's a good kind of rule of thumb to kind of have on average. Food, transportation, and personal items are all variable. That's really dependent on your particular needs. So we definitely consider, how much money would you spend on food? How much would you spend on transportation if needed? Say you had a vehicle, or do you live further away that you're going to need access to public transit, etc. Personal items, whether you have monthly expenses or anything like that, those are all things to consider as well. So we recommend that there are things that you do to consider ways to budget appropriately, utilizing wholesale clubs to split the cost with your housemates or anything like that. I've recently had some students reach out about, some concerns about like access to laundry in their particular areas and whatnot. And so they may utilize a laundry service, or maybe the students in their house kind of chip in and utilize a laundry service, and that'll bring the cost down. So really dependent on what your particular needs are, what your housemates' needs are, et cetera. Those are things to consider. You can call utility companies ahead of time to gauge the average cost of what those utilities are per month. So for instance, if you wanted to estimate what is the gas bill per month, you can call the utility company and say, I'm planning to live at X address, and I just want to get an estimate of what the monthly gas bill is. So that way you can estimate, whether that $150 a month per person is going to be beneficial for you all. Now, keep in mind that gas and electric, as I mentioned, those things are going to vary from month to month, depending on the weather, dependent on use, etc. So those are things that you need to consider. The other thing I want to throw in there is if you have a vehicle, do you need to pay for parking? Many students do not have a vehicle or have a vehicle with an out-of-state license. It can be a little bit challenging to get permits in Medford and Somerville if you are not registered in the state of Massachusetts. So we do recommend that, if you're looking for parking, maybe the space that you're looking for or the house that you're looking for has access to a driveway, or maybe you don't need your car while you're here on campus, et cetera. So those are all things to really consider. And now I'll pass it over to Wenmo.
Thanks, Angie. Yeah, so now we're going to talk a little bit about financial aid and living off campus. And one of the main questions that we get when students are thinking about this is the aid going to be different if I live off campus? And the answer is no. So this kind of slide will go over why that is. And I always use this example: if someone is a sophomore right now and they're getting financial aid, and they're living on campus, obviously. If they were living off campus, they would have had the same aid award. And the reason is that the cost of attendance that we use is the same. So we're assuming these same costs as far as you can see in the graphic, tuition and fees, and then housing and food, because we're not really basing it on rent or something else that you might actually be paying in the future. We're just using the same average cost of a room on campus and the Tufts full plan to assume the cost of housing and food, whether you're living on campus or off campus. Then we have some other estimated out-of-pocket costs, books and supplies and personal expenses. And then, similarly with, how aid is calculated, we figure out the family contribution from the aid application materials that you submit. And then the difference between those numbers is how much aid that you would get. So the big thing to keep in mind is, like when you get an award letter, that is not a bill. And it has those costs that I mentioned, even if you're going to live off campus, because it's not charges. It's just showing you the framework of the costs that the university used to figure out how much aid to offer. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's based on the 9-month academic year, which we'll get into a little bit later. So it doesn't really spread out like if you have a 12-month lease. So that's why we're using the same cost as someone who's living on campus. And so, yes, so the award letter, a lot of you, may be familiar with this if you're on aid. You get that ahead of time and it shows the aid for the full year, but that's not a bill. But that's kind of a explanation for why aid doesn't change, because we're assuming the same costs. And now we'll go to the next slide, which talks more about actually paying for things. Um, yeah. So the bill, unlike the award letter, billing is done by semester. So you have charges for the fall and charges for the spring. Now, the thing that is different for students who live on campus, because like as we noted before, the aid isn't calculated any different. The difference is how much you're charged on your Tufts bill. So if you're someone who has not, done the lottery and been assigned a room, then you're not going to get charged for a room. And also, if you're living off campus, you may decide to cancel your meal plan, or maybe you're getting a lower cost one. So you're gonna get charged less on your Tufts bill. Money that you would normally pay to Tufts directly is gonna decrease. So your balance is lower, and your financial aid goes on to those charges. And so if you have lower charges, your aid kind of goes further as far as paying Tufts. So what you owe, and that's the other thing to keep in mind, is there is no like universal kind of aid or funds issued if you live off campus. Really, what you pay is really dependent on the level of aid that you are awarded. So something to keep in mind, because sometimes people will talk to their friends who maybe they understand to be in similar financial situations, or like, oh, this person had this happen with their bill and that person had that. So it's really, you want to go by your own situation, because that's really what is dependent on how your bill balance looks. But in all cases, if you live off campus, you're not getting charged for a room and you have the option to cancel your meal plan. Now, in some students' cases, their aid may happen to exceed their charges now that they're getting charged less by Tufts. And that's by the semester basis again, because again, the Tufts University bills by semester and the aid is put onto your student account by semester. So if your aid happens to exceed the charges on your bill, you have a credit or a negative balance that to what you would see, and you can request a refund. Now, also there's people who may have been used to getting loans. Maybe their parent get a loan or they get a private loan, and you can still borrow those similar loans. Because again, the cost of attendance that we're using is the same. So even if your charges are less, your aid and maybe your combination of loans will give you that credit and you can request a refund. So the thing to keep in mind is that the refunds only become available. You can request it in SIS after all your aid and loans have come in. You request it in SIS, and it's a lump sum that's given back to you, whatever that amount may be. And again, that's dependent on your amount of aid. There is no set amount for people living off campus. And then you would, get that money to that bank account, and you'd have to budget it over the course of the semester. So it's not like you can get refunds every month. It's not like, you kind of have to have, as Angie kind of mentioned with the budgeting planning, that all set up. So okay, with this refund, this is how much it's going to cover over the course of the semester, either fall or spring. Um, the other thing to keep in mind is that, these refunds, as is noted, are only available, the first day of classes. And there's no aid that's going to be available for the summer months or upfront costs, if you're signing a lease. And as I mentioned before, if you borrow loans and that results in a credit, you can absolutely still do that. So that's an option for you. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. So for this slide, we kind of talk about, like how much, kind of alluding back to Angie's slide about the average cost of housing. So if you're kind of think over a 9-month period in the academic year, like how much can I afford per month? And so kind of going back to the housing costs, that's there, 10,660 divided by 9. The food costs, and that's from the Tufts full meal plan, 8,906 divided by 9. So the total is $2,174 a month, and for rent, food, and all utilities. So that's really the target. If you find a housing situation where your monthly costs are below that threshold, then it's not going to cost you more to live off campus. So when you're kind of looking and budgeting, again, not just the rent, but all the other things like the utilities and all the other things monthly. If it's below that threshold, then, living off campus won't be higher or more costly than living on campus. But again, leases are for 12 months generally. And there's the upfront costs that typically are required first and last month rent, maybe security, in some cases maybe a broker's fee. So unfortunately, these are things that you're going to have to figure out how to cover. Even if you're someone who may have a credit for a refund in the semester, these are things that unfortunately financial aid can't account for. So, and Angie, probably talked about this or maybe mentioned it other times. You may want to try and negotiate with the landlord to reduce the upfront costs, or get a subletter to pay for months where you're not going to be living in your off-campus housing. So there's different things you kind of have to think of, and that's kind of what makes it a little more complex to live off campus because you kind of have to think of these variables. But as I said, going back to the top line of the slide, if you're keeping it under that 2,200 per month, your cost, then that's kind of relatively comparable, and you won't be paying more for living off campus than you do on campus. So yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. My thing kind of moved. All right. So this is a little bit of a breakdown of information based on the cost of your on-campus housing. If you are using financial aid, that's that orange column there. Juniors and seniors who may just be paying the regular rate. As well as students who may be in off-campus housing over a 12-month period. So obviously the financial aid and that first column for juniors and seniors are over a 9-month period. The average cost that you will be paying per month is anywhere from $13,734 up to $22,400, depending on whether or not you're utilizing financial aid. And as a student who is living off campus, you're generally in a similar range over a 12-month period. Things are just kind of spread out a little bit differently. So stuff to really kind of consider here that you're going to see the big differences are, one, yes, the general rate of the rent, the room cost itself, the cost of utilities, gas, internet, and electric, if that's something that you all have to cover, food or meal plan. I have estimated for off-campus students that you likely would not be having a meal plan, but that is not necessarily the case. You can definitely have a meal plan. So just kind of considering those things. The premium 160 and 80 meal plans are kind of the typical ones that we see from students. So that's why those are noted here, but it's not guaranteed that those are the ones you need to utilize. Transportation obviously is dependent on the student. Personal costs are going to be variable, etc. And so your month to months are going to look a little bit different, dependent on your individual circumstance, what you're choosing to spend money on, etc. We definitely recommend considering these kind of main points because these are going to be amongst the more important ones to look at. But we also have an off-campus budgeting worksheet that kind of helps you with navigating like what are my one-to-one month-to-month bills? What are the bills that I need to consider at a one-time level? So whether that's furniture or the upfront fees, et cetera, which I will go over kind of what that looks like as well. These are all things that you can access on our website. Something that we do want to make sure that you all are aware of are those upfront fees. So we've got a first month, which is the first month of your lease, last month, which is the last month of your lease, security deposit, which would be equal to 1 month's rent. And if you're working with a broker, also equal to 1 month's rent, if applicable. And so this slide is really to kind of help you all with understanding the newer kind of changes that have happened in the state of Massachusetts in regards to broker fees, specifically as it relates to you utilizing a broker. It can be really beneficial for a student or a group of students to utilize a broker because it takes some of the weight off looking for stuff, etc. You really kind of have someone on your side to kind of help search for what it is that you particularly are looking for. You can focus on some other things if that's the case. However, there are going to be costs associated with it. So if you have contracted a, relationship with a broker, then you would be responsible for paying the broker's fee. So in reference to the changes that have happened, whomever has contracted the agreement with the broker is the group that is going to be charged the fee. So what does that mean? That means that if you are signing a lease with a landlord off campus and the landlord has had that relationship with the broker, you are not to be responsible for the broker's fee. That is going to be on the side of the landlord because they're the folks who have had the contract with the landlord, with the broker, excuse me. So those are things to really keep in mind. This is effective as of August of this past year. It's not retroactive. So anybody who may have signed something prior to that, it's not going to reverse in any way. And those are things that are really important. So keep those things in mind. I don't say don't look for a broker's fee or a broker to work with, but if that is something that you are able to do, willing to do, that is an option that you do have. There are ways to look for spaces or houses or anything like that that do not have broker's fee. They'll normally be labeled no fee or no broker or something of that sort. So if that is something that you're looking for or anything like that, those are the words that you should be searching. So you're ready to begin your search. That's great. We want to make sure that you're looking in the right locations for this stuff. As I mentioned before, if you utilize Facebook, Facebook does have a various places to look for at. You can go on Facebook Marketplace. You can go on various pages, whether they are the Somerville page or the Medford page or, a class page, class of 2027 page, et cetera, et cetera. Many students do hear back word of mouth. Many students are lucky enough to have spaces kind of handed down from year to year between groups of friends. So ask your friends who may live off campus or anything like that. A lot of times landlords are interested in working with someone that they trust. So, if they've had a good experience with your friends, maybe you are the next best option once your friends move out. Craigslist is still in use. So you can search Craigslist, Zillow, apartments.com, the regular main page for those things as well. But again, we do recommend that in any way that you are searching, whether you're looking at any of these options, or if you're even looking at our partner website with apartments.com, that you're using your due diligence, you're checking and asking lots of questions, you're looking for scams, etc. One thing I will say is if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So we want to make sure that you're asking the right questions, that, you're probably not going to find, a one-bedroom apartment in Brookline for $600 a month. It's likely not going to happen. And if you found it, then I would be shocked. But in any case, those are things to really keep in mind because those are, potential areas where someone can attempt to get money from you and you don't get what you actually need from it. So in any case, our website does allow you the option to flag potential scams. So say, for instance, you're in contact with someone and they ask you to send money ahead of time before you've seen the space or anything like that. We definitely don't recommend that you do that at all. You should always see the space beforehand, and you can always flag that. That information gets sent along to our folks who oversee our website, and we will pull those types of postings down. That is also something to keep in mind. Again, having those tough conversations are going to be really, really beneficial, whether it's with yourself, with your friends, with your potential guardians. Compromise is really important when you're living with other people. You're not going to get 100% of what it is you want, and that's okay, but you need to recognize what are your priorities. So really making sure that you have that information. Understand that even if you are best friends, it doesn't mean that you're going to be the greatest roommates, and we would hate for your relationship to falter as a result of anything housing related or anything like that, especially if you've signed a lease and now you're kind of stuck in that situation for a year. That can be really uncomfortable. It's not easy to leave an off-campus apartment, and it can be very expensive in the long run. So we really want you to use your discretion when having those conversations and trying to search for housemates. Keeping in mind that, your health and wellness is important. So resources that are currently available to you on campus are still available to you for off-campus students. So that's meal plans, health services, counseling and mental health services, student support. We definitely recommend utilizing those resources that are available to you. And then we also provide additional resources for our students who are living off campus that can help with, specific off-campus things. We utilize the Tufts Residential Life social media. So our Instagram page is at Tufts, ORLL, if you want to follow us. We will be sending out newsletters and social media stuff to kind of advertise tips and tricks, things to think about from, different seasons to consider, events that may be happening, affordable recipes, all of those types of things. So we definitely recommend following us and getting that information. And then, of course, just general resources that are available to students, whether it's our off-campus housing page, contacting us, contacting financial aid, etc. So this here is our last slide. I'm going to stop recording at this point.